QSO Today, episode 408, Will Ravenel AI4VE. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Before we start, I want to announce that the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo will return on September 17th and 18th, 2022. I have put an invitation out on email for presentations for the upcoming expo. Google has changed their algorithms for the way that it manages email in Gmail, and our messages may not be delivered. So forgive me if you see my communications more than once in both HTML and text-only format to ensure delivery of my invitations. If you'd like to make a presentation for the next expo, please follow the links on the invitations or on the QSO Today show notes page. I've received many messages from listeners and expo attendees that would like to see presentations by younger hams, especially since us old-timers would like to see what interests our next generation in our beloved hobby. Please use the links to our speaker application found in the emails and on the show notes pages. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Will Ravenel AI4VE, like many of us, returned to amateur radio after raising a family. Will is active in the QRP-ARCI group as its treasurer and takes leadership positions in his ham radio clubs. Will loves to operate ham radio's first digital mode, CW, using either hand at low power. AI4VE shares his operating expertise running low power in the field and on the beach in this QSO Today. AI4VE, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Will?
Yes, Eric. How are you?
I am great, Will. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you? Did you have an interest in electricity, physics, electronics, or something like that when you were even younger?
Not really. I enjoyed electronic toys. Grandfather used to give us great toys every Christmas. I can remember one of them was a small tape recorder, reel-to-reel tape recorder. One was a transistor radio, one of the first. I really enjoyed those toys, but I didn't have any inclination to take them apart or try to understand them.
So how did you find yourself being interested in the high school ham radio club then?
Well, it sounded like something fun. Ham radio, I was into Boy Scouts. I learned Morse code for a merit badge. Problem was I learned it the wrong way. I learned it from dots and dashes on a piece of paper, which, as everyone knows now, is not the way to learn Morse code. And so, I was standing Morse code as a Boy Scout, practicing with friends and using semaphore. But I didn't really get into it until I was in graduate school. I was working on a research platform in the Gulf of Mexico. I went to Florida State for a master's degree in oceanography. And I was working on a research platform off of Panama City. It's about 10 miles out in about 110 feet of water. And we would work 1 week on and 1 week off. And there was a graduate student from Texas A&M named Jack Dill. I can't remember his call sign. But to kill the boredom in the evening, he offered to teach a ham radio class. Myself and one of the women that were out there signed up for it. And we went through it, and he gave us the test. And because of my earlier code experience, I had no trouble with 5 words a minute, and so I passed. As did she. And that was the beginning of my ham radio experience.
Well, it seems to me that for everyone listening, perhaps maybe one of the places that we should be looking for new hams is out on deep sea platforms where you have a captive audience who have nothing to do in their off shift, and we should be offering ham radio classes out there.
Well, that's a thought. I remember when we passed, he sold us an old National, it's an NCX5, I think, which was my first rig. We shared it, and when the summer ended and we went back to school, we sold it.
So he brought it out to the platform, and that's where you used it?
Yeah.
Was he active on the platform?
He was active somewhat, but not so much on the platform. We didn't really get into it. I wasn't thrilled about using Morse code on the air. I guess I had a little bit of Morse code equivalent of night fright and didn't really do much with it. But that's where I was first licensed.
What year was that, do you think?
1979.
How old were you, do you think?
25.
And that was a technician class license?
It was a novice.
Oh, novice. Oh, okay.
And, the code requirement was still full force, 5 words a minute. I didn't do much with it. Oddly enough, one of my main reasons for wanting to pursue the license was because I had this dream that someday I'd do some blue water sailing, long distance sailing. At that time, in the 70s, there weren't much options for ship-to-shore communications. Ham radio was one of the most popular and free. So that's sort of my driving interest. Unfortunately, I never was able to fulfill that dream, but I had a lot of fun with ham radio instead.
Well, can I ask you, it seems to me, at least from a picture that I saw on your QRZ page, it looks to me like you have a nautical history. Were you a young sailor?
Yeah, I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. But when I was about 9, we moved to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And with my first summer job, I bought a small sailboat, something equivalent to a Sunfish, but a competing brand. I used to push the boat out through the surf and sail in the ocean. That's where I pretty basically taught myself to sail from a couple of books. Then when I got my driver's license, I took the boat on this trailer up to a couple of nearby places and ended regattas and would race it. That was a lot of fun. In college, I started out at Duke University in engineering, of all things, based on primarily influence from my father, and hated it. And so after a year and a half, I transferred down to the College of Charleston, which was a small state-run school. It used to be a private university, a city municipal university. But by the time I got there, it was state-owned. Not very large. I think there were probably a few thousand students. And I joined a sailing team with them, was majoring in marine biology. So I spent a lot of time sailing in college. When I went to Florida State, they had a sailing club, and I joined that and got to use their boats in the Gulf. So I've done a fair amount of sailing.
Did you get a skipper's license?
No, I never took any formal course. The requirements here are not as strict as they are in Europe. I have done quite a bit of bareboat chartering in the Caribbean, in Florida. And the requirement is you have to fill out a resume showing that you've got experience. And if they believe you, they give you a boat, which is scary.
Well, it seems that way.
After you've done a few, the resume starts to look pretty good. Now, that's all you need to charter a boat. In Europe, you have to have a skipper's license, I understand.
I have a number of friends here who are hams in Israel who, in order to sail, they actually have to have a skipper's license. And they often will sail with another skipper on board just in case there's some kind of emergency. I'm very interested, though, given this period of time when you were in school and you were talking a little bit about ship-to-shore radio, I was working in the marine radio business on the West Coast. What was available in those days in terms of HF ship-to-shore? I mean, I remember that there were ship-to-shore radios. They looked like they were crystal-controlled, or at least they were on fixed channels. Were those services, or are they just, you'd talk to somebody else on the other end?
They were services. They were single sideband, commercial single sideband, and you had to go through a shore site office, I guess, that handled incoming traffic to get routed to where you wanted to go. It was expensive from my point of view, and a lot of sailors at the time were using ham radio as a cheaper alternative. There was a good bit of drive for people who sailed to get their license. And for instance, there was a program at the time called Sail Mail. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
No.
It was a way to send email, HF through HF, which is very popular with sailors. That and standard just single sideband ham radio, as well as, I guess, CW.
You got this first license as a novice license in 1979, and I think even in those days, was the novice license good for a year, or had that gotten to the point where you could probably keep the novice forever?
I believe at that point you could keep it. I ended up upgrading to general. So I remember technician wasn't a thing back then. And I upgraded to general, past the 13 words a minute. I think in 1984. Yeah, I believe 1984. And I was married at that time. I operated for a few years, and then I started having kids. I had my first child. Things got a little more complicated, so I sort of stopped amateur radio for about 20 years. As I understand, that's a fairly common story.
Well, I would say that's my story as well. I mean, I always had my hand in somehow, but I wasn't active at all. Let me ask you, so during that period of time, from 79 to 84, did you ever get on the air as a novice? I mean, I understand that you kind of felt the Morse code was perhaps difficult and you were even key shy. Did you have an opportunity to build a rig for your novice license during those days?
I did. My uncle was a ham, and my first cousin, his son. And my uncle had a HW101. And when I came home from graduate school, he was excited that I'd gotten a license. And his HW101 was not operating. He said, if you can fix it, you can use it. So I laid it out on the dining room table and opened it up. And I saw a burnt resistor. And so I got a replacement and put it in. Radio fired right up. He thought I must have been some kind of genius, but it was a pretty simple repair. So I used that for a few years, but I wasn't real thrilled with CW at that time, and can't say I did a lot with it.
What were you doing professionally? Now, once you had your master's degree in oceanography, did you go on for a PhD?
No, I was thinking that at one time, but after I'd been in college and graduate school for, I guess, close to 10 years, I had some delays along the way. I had to work my way through. I worked summers, so I couldn't go a full year. At that point, I was tired of school. And I'd also gotten a taste of what academia might be like through my professors. It wasn't that attractive to me. A lot of politics, a lot of backstabbing, frankly, competing for grants. It lost a little bit of its glitter. So when I completed the master's, I went looking for a job. I remember thinking, if I could just get a job that paid $12,000 a year, I'd be set. I ended up interviewing with Western Electric in North Carolina. It was part of AT&T. I interviewed with what was their defense division, and I became a defense contractor. That was in 1980. which was the year I completed my master's thesis.
How did they use an oceanographer, if you don't mind my asking, at Western Electric?
We did a lot of work for the Navy. They had use of our talents. It was classified work, so I can't go into much detail.
It seems to make sense that they would need a broad discipline even to interface to their engineers.
Mm-hmm. As a part of that job, I would go to sea about half of every year for the first few years. Sometimes it would be a month trip. Sometimes it would be 3-month trips back to back. But I got to see a good bit of the world, enjoyed it, and the money was much better than the $12,000 I was hoping for. And so that was the beginning of my career. Unfortunately, I didn't realize until I got my clearance that ham radio was out of the question. We operated INCOM most of the time out there, and that was not allowed, which was a disappointment because I had high hopes of its use there.
So the use of ham radio while working on board ship was prohibited?
On the ships I was on, yes.
I guess it seems to make sense. Were you able to even consider working ham radio at destinations, or maybe there were no destinations?
Well, there were destinations, but I had maybe 5 days off in between trips. And the hassle of trying to get a license to operate in a different country was not that easy. I always felt a little, it made me a little angry that it was so easy for people to come to America and operate from other countries. But even though they have reciprocal agreements, it's sometimes very difficult to do it as an American going abroad, especially with just a short time available.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. You got your general upgrade in 1984. You took this 20-year hiatus from amateur radio. Did you keep the license alive, or did you have to go retest when you decided to come back in?
No, I renewed it as needed. I was not quitting it. I just quitting the hobby. I just didn't have time for it during that period. So I kept the license active. I actually had bought a radio, a Kenwood. It was one of the early solid state transceivers. And it was a pretty nice little rig. I was operating as a general licensee. I was operating in voice mostly. I had no interest in trying code beyond that. So at that time, that's what I was using. And then after my son was born, I wasn't going to have time for it. I sold that radio to a coworker who was from Puerto Rico, and he used it to keep in touch with his family down there.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. If you don't mind my asking, obviously I'm one of these guys, although I was working in radio and I was doing it all day long. So when I came home, doing ham radio didn't seem like the right thing to do with a new family. But there's a lot of people that felt that, raising a family or doing that, they just didn't have time for radio. Is that what you think it was? Is that for some reason having a hobby interest outside of the family, was that it? Was that the reason that perhaps you kind of put it on the back burner?
Well, in my case, I had no trouble operating as a ham radio operator because of my marriage. As a matter of fact, my wife agreed to let me take a buddy pole in my rig on our honeymoon. And when we had some downtime, she would read a book and I'd go out on the terrace and operate from there up in the North Carolina mountains. But when children started coming along, between work and children and family obligations, I just didn't feel I had the time. Plus, keep in mind, I was gone maybe 5 or 6 months out of the year for work.
I see. Yeah, that's different than... I get that. Although I do feel, as I look back on it, that my kids were never exposed to amateur radio. It's so much a part of my life now, and it was even before them, but they've never kind of seen this window into amateur radio in my life. Did your kids later when you got involved again?
Well, I think that's one of the big problems in the hobby these days. When my son was born, he was born in '83. When he got old enough, he actually got a license. He was KS4ODR. I gave him one of my older handhelds. He played with it a little bit, but didn't interest him much. At that point, he was getting into girls and partying and so forth, and just didn't interest him. I think that's a common theme right through today. It's hard for ham radio to compete with today's social life among people and cell phones and computers and so forth.
It seems there's an enormous amount of amygdala stimulation that doesn't lead anywhere, but we all have it, right, in the form of the cell phones and the electronic devices. It uses a lot of time.
Kids just don't understand the fun of the hobby. They look at it and say, why don't you just call? If you want to call and talk to somebody, just give them a call.
Right. What do you think the fun of the hobby is, out of curiosity? I mean, I certainly have my view, but what do you think the fun of the hobby is?
Well, it's a great hobby. It's so diverse. There's so many aspects to it. Maybe the fun of the hobby is probably learning new things.
Right.
And I guess you've heard it said before, it's just kind of magic, especially with QRP. To think that I could get on the air with 5 watts, running, is something as small as a 9-volt battery, and talk to New Zealand.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah, it is, of course. You and I met just recently, last month, at the QRP-ARCI FDIM conference that comes just about the same time as the Dayton Hamvention in Fairborn, which is next to Dayton. So it's a great thing to be able to go to FDIM on Thursday and spend a day with all of your comrades and then go to Hamvention after that on Friday through Sunday. Let me ask you a little bit, because it seems to me that you have an interest in QRP, and I'd like to talk to you about it. But can you talk a little bit about what QRP-ARCI is? And it's my understanding that you've even played a role in it since you've come back to ham radio.
Yeah. When I started work, I was living in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I joined one of the clubs up there. It was Greensboro Amateur Radio Association, GARA, W4GC. And they, at the time, had a deal with some guy who was a tour bus driver, and he would rent a bus, and he'd pick up hams from Burlington, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and then up toward the mountains of North Carolina. And he would drive them up to Dayton. And then he had an arrangement with Dayton University. After classes were out, the rooms were made available for rent. And he would rent the rooms and put us up. And we would get breakfast at the university cafeteria. And then we were on our own for other meals. But he would drive us right to the front door of Hara Arena. And he did it every year for a good while. So I went to Dayton for my first time. It must have been sometime around 1996 or 7. And I went every year because this guy would take you there and back and give you room and partial board for $250.
Oh, that's a deal.
That's hard to beat.
It's hard to beat.
Yeah. And, a lot of people in my club would go, and people in clubs nearby. And it was a perfect setup because you could buy anything you wanted out of the flea market up there. And there was always room under the bus to carry it home, which was a pretty big plus. There was a guy from High Point who used to go, I forget his name, the call sign. But his interest in ham radio was not so much the radio. He was interested in antique, I guess they're antique now anyway, teletype units, the old mechanical teletypes. And he would buy them in the junkyard, haul them to the bus and put them underneath and take them back to High Point. He has a basement full of old, he liked to restore them. We had a basement full of old teletype machines. It was a pleasant way to go to Dayton, especially if you're not within an hour or two.
So even though you went from the 90s, from 97 through today, you were going to the Dayton Hamvention, was this even during the period of time that you were inactive? I mean, did you set aside a special time to go to Hamvention, even though you weren't on active?
Yes, I did. I was not very active on the air, but I was pretty active in the club. As a matter of fact, in 2010, I became president.
Do you advise people when they belong to an amateur radio club that they should take a leadership position after you've taken leadership positions?
Yeah, I do. I think, well, if it's a good club, and this was a pretty good club as ham radio clubs go. I've been in other clubs since that were mostly repeater clubs, and they just didn't interest me much. Their activities were getting together at a Golden Corral for a meeting, stuffing your face and playing with their handhelds. I got pretty bored with repeaters early on when I got into HF, and that kind of a club just doesn't interest me much. I would join and pay dues because I did use the repeaters occasionally, but the club activities were not very interesting.
But, you tell a story. I saw it, maybe it was an Ellicraft newsletter, where you talked about when you got back into CW in 2007 after you did your extra class upgrade, that you acquired a new skill. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in 2007, I had lost my first wife in 1997. She was killed in a car accident. And my kids were old enough to be either in high school or early college. I had more time available. I used to enjoy going to the Charlotte Hamfest from Greensboro. It's about an hour and a half. And it was a good one. And I don't know, I woke up one morning and I just kind of missed it. So I thought, I ought to go to Charlotte. It was the springtime. They usually met around March. Not sure if they're still doing it or not. But I went down there and I thought, well, as long as I'm going, I may as well try to upgrade to extra. So I bought, not proud to say it, I bought a question and answer book. Not a study book, but a memorization book. And went through the questions until I felt pretty comfortable. And I took practice classes on QRZ. I got to a pretty high pass rate. So I felt good enough to go ahead and, when I got to Charlotte, sign up for the testing. Ended up passing. So while I was there, I thought, I don't even have a rigs. And so I went and bought a Tentec Argo 5, which was a 20-watt rig. As you know, Tentec was renowned for their CW capabilities, full break-in, and really nice sounding code. That sort of sparked my interest in lower power. I wasn't working 5 watts, but 20 watts, most people those days would have considered that close to QRP. And I was doing fine with it. And I felt, this was the year after the FCC dropped the code requirement. I felt a little bit guilty that I had passed extra without doing 20 words a minute. So I sort of decided that I would only operate code till I could get to 20 words a minute. And then if I didn't like it, I'd go back to voice. Well, turned out I liked it a lot after I started using it. It's a little bit like associating with a higher class of hams. You don't get any of that garbage you hear on sideband. People are more courteous and friendly, I found. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So with the Argonaut and the extra license, I was able to take advantage of some of the lower ends of the bands, and I had a lot of fun.
When I asked you about acquiring a new skill, you did something with paddles, right? You decided that you were going to use your paddles in a certain way, and I thought that was quite interesting.
I decided that, I knew code, but I didn't. Up to that point, I'd not used anything except straight keys, but not much of that. So I decided I had to learn how to use a paddle, and I decided that I would use it left-handed, so that my right hand was free to write. And it wasn't difficult. If you haven't already learned how to use a paddle with your right hand, learning to use it with your left hand is not any more difficult. So that worked out pretty well. I set the polarity on the thing so that it used the same thumb and finger, for code that right-handers used. That way, if I was at a hamfest or something, I could sit down at most paddles, use it left-handed without any difference, which came in really handy a few times.
Can you send with your right hand as well? Does it change your brain a little bit?
Not terribly. It's funny, when you go to your right hand, the only problem is you're slower. But it's pretty easy to pick up. I had a stroke a year and a half ago that affected my left side. And so I can't use my left hand anymore for code. And I'm in the process of trying to get better with my right hand. But it is a little slower. It comes pretty naturally, but I just don't have the speed I had with my left hand. Not yet.
You know, many of the people that are listening to the QSO Today podcast are probably in an age where they're more susceptible to debilitating illnesses that come with age, right? You bring up something interesting about your stroke. I'm just curious, do you think that operating CW, and even having worked on your left side, do you think that there's some advantages in terms of recuperating from some kind of brain illness like stroke that comes from operating CW? Do you see it like helping your recuperation?
I'd like to think so, but in reality, I'm not so sure. My stroke was in my right brainstem, and it didn't affect much cognitive, my cognitive ability. When it's in the brainstem, it doesn't affect your speech much or your thinking. So I'm not sure in that case it really helped me, but certainly hasn't hurt.
And it's one of the things that you also like to do very much. That kind of helps if you're, I guess, looking at recovering, doing something that you enjoy doing.
Well, that's true. Given me a little bit of motivation. It's not easy now. I like to operate remotely, the outdoors. It's not as easy to set up anymore. Simple things like just getting your rig out to a table where you can sit and operate takes a lot of energy.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Let me ask you something. I saw some pictures online that you built a Elecraft K2. Do you want to talk a little bit about that project? How did that go for you? I mean, you did some magnificent pictures of, the K2 in various states from being in the box and to the finished rig. What was that like for you to build that?
Well, that was a lot of fun. It's funny, what happened is I sort of gravitated towards QRP based partly on the 10 Tech I had. Some of the reading I did, I actually remember reading about Wayne Burdick designing the K2, and it was a very popular radio for a while. I thought, boy, it would be fun to have one of those. So I built a K1 to sort of practice and operated it for a while. It's a little 5-watt radio that Wayne designed actually after the K2. But it was a good way to kind of test your skills for building. And my plan was that I would go on to the K2 next. But instead, I got the itch to hear what a really good receiver sounded like. And so I bought a K3 when it came out. And it was a K310, 10-watt K3. I did put a 100-watt power amplifier in it at one point, but I really never used it. I was, at that point, pretty stuck on QRP. And then I bought the K2 and built it after I had the K3. It was the most complicated kit I've ever built, but it was not difficult. Anybody could do it if you just had the patience and took the time.
I built it as well, and I found probably the most difficult thing was actually winding the toroids.
Well, a lot of people say that. I've never had trouble winding the toroids. I lose count of the turns.
That's it.
But you just keep doing it until you think you're close. Then you go through the painful exercise of actually counting them until you have it right. But I've never really, a lot of people complain about toroids. I've never had much trouble flying toroids.
I use a sewing needle to count.
I use a toothpick.
I built the K2 as well. I thought that was a great rig to build because it was all through-hole parts, so there was no surface mount in there. And you actually got a chance as you went along to see, how these radios go together. And you felt really comfortable, didn't you, like going under the hood if you had to make any changes?
Oh, yeah, that was not hard, especially with all the documentation that was available for the rig. It did give me a little better understanding about how radios work, but I can't say I ended up understanding exactly how it worked. I kind of equate it to the old paint by number paint sets.
That's right, yeah.
Doesn't make you an artist. You might produce something that looks pretty good, but you're basically following instructions one step at a time and doing what they say. And even though they had a pretty good section on the theory of the radio that explained in some detail how it worked, I never really became that good at electronics to understand how to. I could not have built a simple radio from scratch.
So your electronic bench then handles the kits, but you don't build QRP rigs from scratch parts?
No, I don't. I wish I could. I tell people that all the electronics I know I learned from ham radio, but that doesn't mean it goes very deep. It did help me. I applied for the job with Western Electric. They noted, because it was on my resume, that I was a ham radio operator. And I think they gave me points for that. I mean, a lot of the work, they were hiring technicians, mostly ex-Navy. And when you're at sea, sometimes you have to do repairs on equipment. So the fact that I knew a little bit, I think gave me a leg up in getting that first job.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I think that happens more times for hams than they actually think. I was telling you, Arun Kumar, W8ARU, in last week's episode, and he says that when I see a ham radio call sign on a resume, I just hire the guy. I already know what he can do. What do you think of that?
Well, it wasn't, I think, that straightforward because the work I did was not
electronics.
Yeah, but I think it did give me a little bit of a leg up. They commented on it during the interview, seemed very pleased.
I think there were a lot of hams at Western Electric, throughout its history.
Yeah, there certainly were in its day. We had a ham club at our location and a station we could operate. We had antennas, a beam up on the roof. And we could go into the station at lunchtime and play ham radio for an hour before we went back to work. And you may be aware Western Electric has I think it's still ongoing, it's a contest every year called CQWE, which is nationwide. You report your station as part of the response, your location. Because, as you know, AT&T was all over the place in America. So there were people in Western Electric clubs all over the country.
Well, as a kid, I was into Western Electric phones. At 12 years old, I knew my Western Electric phones pretty cold. Maybe those are the only kind of phones in those days.
I think they pretty much had the monopoly on phones.
They had the market, yeah. You wrote an article about working QRP from the beach. Looks like for a ham radio newsletter. So in that article, you discuss working RTTY on the KX3 with the paddles. Wayne actually showed me that you could do that, one time when I was visiting. And I was curious, the way that works, you're sending Morse code and the radio translates it to RTTY, and then it reads RTTY back on the screen. But I was wondering whether or not you got to the point where perhaps you could even decode RTTY in your head, because what is it? It's a mark in a space, right? It seems to me that you might be able to decode it in your head.
I've heard people say that they can do that, but I'm not sure I believe it. It's RTTY is it's not like CW. You can't really recognize characters. I can't anyway. But the capability that Wayne built into the KX3 was amazing. I had some fun with that. And it was an interesting feeling to be sending CW and hear it go out as RTTY, and then to see a response come back on the screen. Of course, at that point, I was a little slower than RTTY operation, but people didn't seem to mind that. And it was a lot of fun. You could also do it with the PSK16, I think.
Do you actually get the side tone, the CW side tone in your ear? Or are you hearing, as you're sending, are you hearing it as RTTY or PSK16?
Well, you hear both.
Ah, okay.
Still get the CW side tone, otherwise it would be difficult to send.
Yeah, I would think so.
But simultaneously, after a short delay, you'd start hearing RTTY start up. And it didn't seem to interfere with the CW much because I couldn't interpret it, just noise. You'd hear that go over the air, and you'd receive RTTY back as RTTY, and it would show on the screen. It didn't require an external computer to do this.
I just want to make sure I understand, Will, because I think you said earlier that you'd like to operate remote. What I think that means is you like operating in the field and not by remote control. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now you're in Hilton Head, South Carolina. You wrote this article that you were operating on the beach, and I guess maybe since the stroke you're not operating on the beach as much. But do you still like to operate on the beach?
I do. I don't, as you said, I haven't much since the stroke. But before, it was a lot of fun to go down. I have a 31-foot jackkite pole, telescopic fiberglass pole. And I came up with, I think you probably saw in that article, I came up with a way to anchor that on the beach to a piece of rebar that I would hammer down into the hard sand. I would operate with a end-fed antenna hung from the top of that pole, sitting in a beach chair with a clipboard in my lap, which held something to write on. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, well, I'm going to come up with a solution for you. And that is, you can get an electric beach cart, I think at Target.
Target, huh?
Yeah, I'll send you a link because I'm thinking, what Will needs is he needs a way to schlep all his stuff down on the beach, but that doesn't get stuck in the sand. So it has to have the big balloon tires. You should be able to pull it and with a little electric assist, be able to schlep all your equipment down onto the beach. Maybe even secure the pole to the beach cart itself so that you don't have to be driving rebar into the sand as a way to get down there and enjoy the afternoon at the beach operating.
Yeah, I'd be very much interested in that.
I figure somebody who's had to have done this already. I'll do a little bit of research and I'll send that to you. I think that would be really fun. I find that the biggest problem I have with the beach is the sand. Getting over the sand. I have a wife who's handicapped, so she hates the beach. I love the beach. I grew up at the beach, but she hates it because it's very hard to navigate if you're a handicapped person. So,
well, that's true. I have been on the beach. My wife and some of the grandkids came to visit. She rented one of those big balloon carts, but it was not motorized. And it turns out it was very difficult to turn. It didn't have swivel wheels. And so she had to ask for help from some people on the beach to make, turn it around with me in it. Very difficult.
Okay, so there is a solution, and because we're ham radio operators, we're always looking for a solution that allows us to operate wherever we want, whenever we want. Let me ask you a question, Will. What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, I think you probably get a very similar answer from most people you interview. I think we're a very aging population. If you go to 4 days in May, or even Dayton, you see very few younger people, very few women, And it's a very diverse hobby in terms of the aspects you can use it for, but it's not a very diverse hobby from the human point of view. I think keeping the hobby going into the future could become difficult.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Do you have any thoughts on how we might attract younger people into the hobby? As you're sitting on the beach looking out to sea, I always have those moments. Do you have those moments?
I do. And I hear a lot of people come walking by and they're curious at this big pole with the wire. And they see me with a paddle. And they say, "Is that some kind of fishing pole?" And I'll say, "No, it's amateur radio." And the most common response I get is, "You mean people still do that?"
That's my opening paragraph. Do people still do that?
So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how invisible we are. There's not much ham radio publicity anymore. And because of restrictive covenants in neighborhoods, I think it's becoming less common for young people growing up to know a ham.
Yeah, we can't really advertise the way we once did, right? With the big tower and
No.
the beam.
Not unless you've got the means to buy some property out in the country somewhere and put up a tower.
Do you have something that you give away, like a card or a brochure or something like that, when somebody comes up and asks you, and to see so that they might find a resource or even call you back?
No, that's a good idea. If there is interest, I mean, some people stop and talk a little while, and it interrupts my operation, but I'm always glad to talk about ham radio, so I can give them a little bit of information verbally. But I've never brought brochures out with me. Every now and then, very rarely, but every now and then, somebody would walk up the beach and he'd stop and just look for a while at me. And then he'd say, "What band are you on?"
There's a live one right there.
Yeah, that's pretty rare.
So if you've got this 30-foot pole up in the air, where's the end of the wire? Do you actually throw it out into the ocean?
No. I try to get close to the ocean, which is a bit of a nuisance because the tide is constantly changing.
Right.
But you have to be on some pretty hard sand to get a stake in the ground that'll hold the pole.
Mm-hmm.
And so I usually operate it as a sloper, with the going from the top of the pole down to my chair, pointed towards the ocean. That way I get a little bit of saltwater gain, I think, towards Europe. And I have no trouble talking with various European countries from the beach at 5 watts.
I bet that's great.
It's a lot of fun.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now? You got to go to Dayton and you got to go to FDIM, which I had such a wonderful time this year that I'm really kind of jazzed. I'm thinking that things are really exciting. What's exciting you right now?
Well, I guess I'd have to say just being able to get out for a meal sometimes is exciting to me right now. But in ham radio, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. I'm not very much interested in the digital modes, except from a curiosity point of view. I tried operating PSK and RTTY and a couple of other digital modes, and didn't find them that satisfying compared to code. Code is a very conversational mode, like you're talking to somebody, whereas the digital modes tend to encourage people to pre-write scripts and just hit a button. So you don't feel like you're really conversing. At least I don't.
You're connecting but not connecting.
You're connecting, but you're certainly not conversing, really. I don't feel like I'm having a conversation. And then with the newer modes today, you're not even doing that. Your computer do most of the work. I'm not criticizing people who like that. That's the beauty of ham radio. There's something for everybody, but that's just not what I enjoy.
You had a chance to attend the vendor night at FDIM. I think I saw you there. Was there one device there that when you saw it, if you thought you had it, it might help improve the way you do what you do?
Well, there's certainly lots of things there that I lust after, but not many I can afford.
Let's take the price is no limit. What was the most exciting thing that you saw there?
Well, I'd love to be able to buy a K4 and play with it. I didn't see much of anything else that was out of the ordinary at this particular hamvention. I was not able to get into the flea market areas because of my limitations. I rented a scooter when I was there at the fairground. I didn't see much that seemed to be that new, and maybe it was because this was an off year, first year after COVID coming back to Dayton. There were a lot of vendors I was hoping would be there that weren't. I didn't really see anything new.
Maybe I just don't go to enough shows. I was kind of excited by all of it.
Well, it didn't help that I came back with COVID.
Me too. Actually, I heard there was like 16 of us that all hung out together, and we all came back with COVID.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I didn't know I had it till I got home, and then I slept for 2 days. I was exhausted. I think that's part of COVID. It takes all the energy away.
Well, I must say that traveling internationally, this is advice to anybody who's traveling internationally. Don't do it if you don't have to. If you do decide to do it, boy, they kept rerouting me. Every day I'd look at my schedule and I was going to a different city until the morning I was supposed to fly out of Dayton, they'd also rerouted me again to a different airport.
Well, especially these days.
I was grateful to get home. And then don't check your luggage because it may not get to your destination if you need it. So I had luggage going home. I didn't have luggage coming to the United States because they gave me such a tight schedule that I probably wouldn't have gotten it. And then the stuff that I sent home, if I had to wait 3 weeks for it or not at all, that wouldn't have been, a big loss. So, but right now you're kind of, especially this summer for people who may be listening, boy, they're overbooked. More people are traveling this summer than have traveled in years, apparently. They're short 30,000 pilots in America.
I know. I see the news every night and all the cancellations and people stuck halfway and things like that.
And there's a zen to it, too. You have to, make sure you have food in your bag as you're in the airport or whatever, or lots of money on your credit card so you can buy food or whatever, but just go with the flow.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't help to get upset. And people who get upset at the flight attendants or the desk clerks are especially troublesome. It's not their fault.
The other thing I might say before we go, and that is that use a travel agent. You have an emergency number too. So as your flight is being canceled and you're standing in line at the gate, if you get on your phone with your travel agent, they can get to the computer and reroute you before you get to the counter to a flustered lady behind the counter who has a whole bunch of angry people at her. So as an international flyer, I like using a travel agent rather than buying online so I can actually have somebody working for me in the background as I'm trying to find a new flight.
Well, that's a good idea. Of course, I traveled quite a bit for my job internationally, and I relied on the frequent flyer program. The special number they would give you, I would often get somewhere where a flight was delayed or canceled, and I'd call them, and they would take care of it.
Well, because you were probably Premier or something like that, right? You had enough miles that your status was high enough.
I at least reached gold level. So, yeah, I got maybe a little bit of priority, but they were very good at helping me out when I was stuck.
Now, the other thing I've done is you can take your ticket to another airline. If there's another airline going to your destination and your flight gets canceled, you can actually go to the other airline's desk and see, would you take my ticket? And I've done that a couple times.
I've done that before too, and that usually works. But I haven't had to travel by air much lately.
And that's a blessing.
Yeah. It's funny, though, one of the things I love about Dayton and 4 Days in May, and you asked about that. I don't know if I ever answered your question when you asked about QRP-ARCI. As I got into QRP, I found out about QRP, Amateur Radio Club International is the full name. I became more interested. I joined. And because I was able eventually to, when I realized they did their own convention simultaneously with Dayton, I started going. I think 2013 was my first time there at 4 Days in May. I'd been going to Dayton since 2007 or so, and didn't even know about it. But it's one of the fascinations for me, Eric, and you're an example. If you go to Dayton or you go to 4 Days in May, especially, you get to meet fascinating people. I mean, a lot of the big names in ham radio, including you, are there. And I don't know if you remember, but I met you actually the first time several years ago at a 4 Days in May. You had a small breakout session where you interviewed people, not on the air, but just talked to them. And I was in that crowd.
I kind of felt I was with my people. That 40 Days in May feels like that.
It's a great gathering, especially if you are into QRP. And you meet a lot of interesting people. I mean, to be able to talk with Asher Farhan or Hans Sumner or a lot of the dignitaries in ham radio one-on-one is to me, it's a thrill.
And people are so talented. What I like about 4 Days in May is that you have these QRP kind of lends itself very well to building, whether it's kit building or modifying, tube rigs. So Grayson Evans was there, with his Thermotron books.
He's a bit of an anomaly.
He is, but you know what? He's a builder. And so for some reason, that group is a great group for people who just like to put their hands in it.
It's a lot of fun to go to their homebrew session contest where people bring out things they've been working on and show you transceivers they've built from scratch and things like that. It's although I don't know that I still cannot do that, and I don't know if I ever will, but it's fascinating to see. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of talent there.
So I highly advise people who are looking for their community that if they have an interest in SOTA or Parks on the Air or Working CW or QRP, or that the QRP-ARCI FDIM convention might be the community for you as well.
Well, after I'd been there a few times, I think it was 2017 or so, I volunteered to serve as treasurer, and I've been doing that since.
Good for you.
It's not a lot of work, but it requires a bit of time. It just makes you feel like you're giving back a bit.
That's right. And their magazine is absolutely terrific. So it's a quarterly magazine, so it comes out 4 times a year. But it's a great magazine to read. I get that as well. What can I tell you? I think that anybody that wants to know more about QRP-ARCI can send me a message or look it up. I'll put a link in this week's show notes page so that people can go there and see. And if you have an interest in all those things I just mentioned, then that's a great place to start, and the people are very nice.
Yeah, they are. I had an interesting experience this time. It took me 2 days to get there. It took Asher Farhan 2 days to get there.
Well, it took me 2 days to get there.
I was driving. I stopped in Knoxville, Tennessee, overnight there, and then I finished the second day up to Dayton because I'm a fair distance from Ohio, and it was kind of interesting to hear Asher and Hans say, "Oh, it took me 48 hours to get there." I'd say I did too.
You should know that's continuous traveling.
I understand. Yeah, I've done that. It's not fun.
It means you're not really sleeping. You're not really sleeping on planes. Unless you're traveling business class, the seats don't have enough pitch for you really to sleep.
No, I understand. I've never had much luck sleeping on planes, but The longest trip I think I ever did was down to Melbourne, Australia.
That's a good long one.
Yeah, that gave me a taste of what you might be going through. I remember, it was 4 hours to California, and then we had an unfortunate layover of about 6 hours. And then I flew out of LAX. It was a 15-hour flight down to Sydney.
Yeah, well, that's actually not so bad for LA. For me to fly from Tel Aviv to Los Angeles or San Francisco is 15 hours because you're also going into the jet stream. So when you're coming back, it's actually 12 hours. You actually get a 3-hour break.
Yeah, same as going from the East Coast to the West Coast. It takes longer to get there than it does to come home.
Yeah, a tailwind.
Tailwind, yeah.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams, Will?
I'd say read a lot, find out what's going on in the hobby, and then pick your favorite part and pursue it. Join a club for sure, because even if you don't have an individual you call an Elmer, if you join a club, it's full of Elmers. And lots of activities. If it's a good club, lots of activities that you can take advantage of.
They say that Israelis are like the sabra fruit. So the sabra fruit in Israel is a cactus, right? It's prickly on the outside and sweet on the inside. So some of these elder hams in these clubs are like sabras. So they tend to be prickly on the outside, maybe a little even weather-worn and hard on the outside. But you know what? If you ask questions and you push a little bit, you'll actually break them down, and you'll find that there's some very nice people who would be excellent Elmers.
Yeah, that's true.
You have to push a little bit.
You have to show interest, and if you show interest, they'll show interest in you.
Exactly.
But all ham clubs are not alike, and there are certainly some pretty bad ones. I won't give the name of the club, but I was a member of a club at one point. As I said, it was one of those primarily repeater clubs. They would meet at a Golden Corral, have a meal, and then do business of the club, and it was pretty boring. So I asked one time, there was an old guy who'd been there forever. He wasn't the current president, but he was the de facto head of the club. He was one of the founders. And I asked him one time, do you ever have speakers, programs? And he said, I'll never forget, he said, we tried that once. It didn't work. Can you imagine? It didn't work.
I can imagine. And that's why, it's like spinning the dial. If you hear conversations you don't like on ham radio, you spin the dial. The great thing about ham radio is there's thousands of clubs in America.
That's true. Not necessarily in your area, but...
Maybe not. But nowadays, many of those clubs are virtual now.
If you're in a medium city, you may have 3 or 4
right
available. The best club, other than QRP-ARCI, of course, but the best club I was ever a member of, unfortunately only for a year, was the North Fulton Amateur Radio League up in Atlanta.
They won a prize, I think, this year at Dayton, right?
Yeah.
Was that why you were there at the prize dinner?
No. I was there so maybe I would win a prize, which didn't happen. I hardly ever win anything. But I spent a year in Atlanta when I got engaged, and with my future wife, and joined North Fulton Amateur Radio League, and it was a very active club and a lot of fun. I also joined North Georgia QRP Club, which had some of the same people. It was an interesting club. They advertised that there were no officers and no rules, and to join, you simply said, I would like to be a member. And they would meet once a month and share what projects you're working on or anything you're doing. And you'd go around the table and people would bring in show and tell. It was a lot of fun. But North Fulton was a full-blown ham club. They've won awards in the past for from the ARRL as being one of the top clubs in the country. I think you may have known Jim Stratton. Jim, yeah. He won Ham of the Year one year. He was a member there, and I think he was a lot of the reason you interviewed him at one time, I think. But he was a lot of the reason that club was as good as it was. He was very enthusiastic about ham radio.
What was his call sign?
I believe it was...
and I'm not speaking about him in the past tense. I'm just asking.
Well, he is a silent key now.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately. But his call sign was W4QO. He'd go by Quaker Roads.
Oh, Jim Stafford.
Jim Stafford. I may have misspoken.
Yes, I did interview him in episode 120.
Yes.
And I recognized that he's a silent key. So, yeah. He was a great ham.
Yeah, he was president of ARCI at one point, too. He was just one of those guys who you couldn't help but get enthusiastic if you weren't before after you talked to him.
That's right.
He was a big promoter of ham radio.
Well, Will, I want to thank you. I realized that in our emails back and forth that you didn't think we'd have anything to talk about, but here we go. We've been talking for almost an hour and a half, and it's been absolutely wonderful, and I am so grateful that you said yes and that you came on the QSO Today podcast. So I want to wish you 73, and as promised, I'll send you some links on an electric beach wagon.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, and I enjoyed it, Eric.
Thank you so much. 73, Will.
72. 72 is one less, QRP.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Will. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an AI4VE in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.